There was a vote. 32 people raised their hands. 18 did not. The subject of the vote was a 3-year-old girl named Shirin. I want to begin there, with that number, because I think everything else in this story follows from it. Not from the disease, not from the fear, not from the medical reports or the official statements or the legal opinions. From 32 hands going up in a room in an alpine town in Austria, and 18 hands staying down, and a grandmother sitting in a chair watching both. The grandmother's name was Erika Bogner. I know her name because a journalist wrote it down, and the piece appeared in a Vienna magazine called Profil, and a colleague sent me a copy sometime in the spring of 1990. It was a long piece about the spread of the epidemic among children in Austria, how it had arrived, which populations it had reached, what the public response had been. The Shirin story was one section, 3 paragraphs. The specificity of it, the town, the number, the grandmother's name, was what stopped me. Statistics can absorb almost anything. 3 paragraphs can hold a vote. What I know about Shirin is limited. She was 3 years old. She had tested HIV-positive, where she had contracted the virus the article did not say, and I did not find out afterward, and I am going to say something about that silence before we move on. In those years, when a child of 3 tested positive, the most common explanations were transmission at birth from an infected mother, or contaminated blood products received during a medical procedure in the first years of life. Neither of these was a choice the child had made. Both were things that happened to children, as things happen to children, without their knowledge or consent or any failing on their part that an honest person could identify. I say this not to persuade you of something you probably already believe, but because the situation that followed suggests that the 32 people in the room had not organized their thinking around this particular fact. Erika Bogner had applied to enroll her granddaughter in the local kindergarten in Aschach. Aschach is a small town in the Alpine region of Austria, the kind of place that appears in travel descriptions as quiet, orderly, scenic in the particular way of that part of Europe. She had filled out the form, as you fill out forms, and at some point the relevant box had been completed honestly, and the news had reached the other parents, and a meeting had been called. I try to imagine that meeting every time I return to this story, which I do more often than I can easily explain. A room somewhere, a classroom perhaps, or the local community hall, the kind of room with chairs that scrape on the floor and a window that doesn't quite close. Parents who had come in the evening from their households, an agenda. At some point in the agenda, the item about Shirin, arguments made by whom and in what order the article did not record, though I imagine both sides were represented, because 18 people eventually kept their hands down, and 18 is not nothing. And then a vote. A few weeks after I read the profile piece, a colleague sent me a clipping from a regional Austrian paper that had covered the same meeting in a shorter dispatch. Most of it repeated what I already knew. One line did not. The reporter had recorded a single sentence from the floor of the meeting without attribution. The speaker was not named, and it was not noted whether that speaker had raised their hand or kept it down. The sentence was, "This is not about her health. It is about our children, who will have to think about this every day." I read the line several times. I think it explains, as well as anything in the longer article did, why the Supreme Sanitary Council statement had not reached the room. The Council had addressed a question about transmission. The room was discussing a different question, what the daily presence of the fact of Shirin's illness would do to the mental lives of the other children. These are not the same question. The medical authorities had answered the one they were qualified to answer. The room had voted on a different one. The arguments never met. 32 hands went up, 18 did not. The meeting concluded. Erika Bogner went home with her granddaughter, who had been voted out of a room she had not yet been permitted to enter. What Bogner said to the journalist afterward is the sentence I have turned over the most times. She said she could understand her neighbor's fear. She said they simply did not know enough. I have tried to find a way to read that sentence as anything other than what it most obviously is, an act of generosity toward people who had just done something that was not generous. She was not minimizing what had happened. She was not pretending it was acceptable. She was offering to people who had not offered her granddaughter the same courtesy, an explanation that did not require them to be monsters. They were frightened. They did not know enough. These were true things, and she said them. What they did not know, or chose not to weigh, was this. The Supreme Sanitary Council of Austria had issued a formal statement on this question. The statement was not vague or hedged or qualified in ways that might leave reasonable room for doubt. It said that the presence of an HIV-positive child in a kindergarten school or any similar shared facility posed no danger to the other children and adults present. The Council was summarizing a body of research and observation that had been accumulated across several years in several countries. The virus was not transmitted through the air, through casual contact, through shared objects, through the ordinary physical proximity of children playing together. The specific conditions required for transmission, direct blood-to-blood contact, or specific sexual contact, were not created by children going to kindergarten together. The Council had addressed the scenario that frightened people most directly imagined. What if an infected child bites someone? They had examined the specific case in which this had occurred, where an infected child had bitten a sibling and the question of transmission had been raised. The virologists who studied the case found no transmission. They explained why. The concentration of virus in saliva, even in someone with significant viral load, was not sufficient to establish infection through bite transmission, particularly when the skin was not severely broken in a way that allowed substantial blood contact. The bite case had been examined, documented, and resolved with a finding of no transmission. The Council said so clearly. A virologist named Kunz was quoted in the profile piece explaining all of this in the careful language of his profession. He went through the evidence systematically. He noted what was known and what remained uncertain and was precise about the difference. And then he said, and this is the sentence the journalist chose to quote, which tells you something about what the journalist thought was most important, that excluding HIV-positive children from kindergartens, schools, and shared facilities was a disgrace for a civilized country. He was not alone. The article quoted doctors and lawyers and teachers, all using different language and different frameworks, and arriving at the same word: disgrace. The legal position was clear. The child had rights. The medical position was clear. There was no danger. The educational position was clear. Exclusion from childhood developmental settings caused real and lasting harm to children who were already facing serious illness. Every expertise available said the same thing. And then the article added, in its final line, but rational arguments often do not reach the consciousness of a crowd maddened by fear. Among the teachers the journalist had spoken to was one who worked at the kindergarten in Aschach, the same kindergarten Shirin had been excluded from. She had not been permitted to vote. The meeting had been called for parents, and she was staff, and her view was recorded in the article rather than registered in the tally. She told the journalist that she had worked with small children for 20 years, that she had 2 of her own at home, and that if Shirin had been placed in her group, she would have worked with her the way she worked with all of them. She was confident. She said that the other children in the group would have accepted Shirin without the kind of questions their parents were now asking on their behalf. She added one observation which the journalist had set off on its own line at the end of the paragraph. Children this age, she said, do not know what a virus is. They know what a friend is. The rest they can learn later. I have been thinking about that sentence for years, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a problem that seems simple and keeps revealing new angles. The crowd in the article was not a mob. The parents who came to the meeting in Aschach were not people who had abandoned reason for passion. They had come to a meeting. They had heard arguments. They had conducted a vote according to procedure. The form of democratic deliberation had been followed, and the outcome was still that a 3-year-old girl was not permitted to attend kindergarten. This is something different from a mob. A mob is frightening, but it is also, in some ways, legible. It is fear or rage without structure, and it eventually disperses, and its victims can potentially be identified and the perpetrators held accountable. What happened in Aschach was fear with structure. Fear that had passed through the forms of reason and emerged with 32 votes. This is harder to hold onto analytically because it does not fit the category of unreason the way a mob does. The people who voted had, in some formal sense, reasoned their way to a conclusion. The conclusion was wrong. contradicted by every relevant authority and every available fact. But it had the form of a decision made through deliberation. This is what the epidemic was producing across the countries where it had arrived early enough for this phase to have played out already. Not only disease, not only death, but a kind of civic test that most communities were failing. The test was simple in its formulation and apparently very difficult in practice. Could a community, when frightened, extend to its most vulnerable members the protection that its formal institutions said they were owed? The evidence accumulated slowly and was not encouraging. I knew something about the Austrian context by then. The country was genuinely anxious, and the anxiety had sources that were not entirely irrational, even if its expression often was. Austria received an enormous number of tourists every year from every part of the world. It was a transit point, a destination, a country whose borders were crossed constantly by people coming from regions where the epidemic was more advanced. The most recent survey of Austrian public opinion had found that more than 80% of respondents believed the disease could threaten their own health. More than 80% in a country where the actual case count was still small enough that most people had no direct personal knowledge of anyone who had died. The fear was larger than the facts that should have been generating it. This is how fear works when the facts are not clear and the imagination is given room to supply what knowledge does not provide. Austria also had its particular anxiety about prostitution and AIDS. The country had legalized street prostitution in designated zones, and the registered women were required to undergo regular health checks. But the question of who was actually getting tested and how reliably was a source of ongoing concern. That the newspapers treated periodically with the combination of alarm and prurience that newspapers tend to apply to such questions. The epidemic, in other words, was not abstract in Austria. It was attached to actual debates about actual policies about actual people. The fear that landed on Shirin was not created in a vacuum. It had accumulated from many sources, only a small number of which had anything to do with a 3-year-old girl. None of this makes what happened in Aschach less wrong. I am not making the argument that the 32 parents were reasonable people doing reasonable things. I am making a different argument, that what they did was done by frightened people who had been given insufficient information in a sufficient time, and who, in the absence of that information, used their fear as a guide. The 18 who kept their hands down had, by whatever combination of temperament and knowledge and moral luck, arrived at a different decision. The distance between 32 and 18 is not a distance between monsters and heroes. It is the distance between people who, in a specific moment of fear and uncertainty, made different choices. What I think about when I return to this story is Sweden. At roughly the same time, in the same year, the Swedish school system had incorporated AIDS education into the curriculum in a systematic way. Swedish school children were being taught in class, by teachers, with materials, not only what the disease was and how it was transmitted, but practical information about prevention. This was not universally welcomed. There were Swedish parents who objected, who found the discussions inappropriate for children of certain ages, who wrote letters and attended their own meetings, and expressed their own concerns. But the educational system had decided that the fear could be addressed by giving it something accurate to attach itself to, not abstract reassurance, not official statements from councils that people in meetings were going to evaluate according to their own level of trust in official statements. Information that people could actually use. The fear in Sweden did not disappear. The fear in Sweden had the same sources as the fear in Aschach, the same epidemic, the same uncertainty, the same absence of a cure, the same reports from other countries. What was different was what the fear had to work with. In Sweden, it had information. In Aschach, it had 32 chairs and a vote. Erika Bogner said she could understand her neighbor's fear. I believe her. I think she understood it in the specific way that people understand things they are living inside of, not as an abstraction, not as a case study, but as the actual texture of a specific community in a specific moment of terror, making a decision she would have to live alongside for the rest of whatever time Shirin had left. The generosity of her statement is not naive. It is the generosity of someone who understands that the neighbors are also going to be there tomorrow and the day after, and that the question of what to do with that fact is more complicated than the question of whether the vote was wrong. The vote was wrong. The 18 who kept their hands down were right. The Supreme Sanitary Council was right. The virologist Kunz was right. And a 3-year-old girl named Shirin was not permitted to attend kindergarten in the autumn of 1990. in a civilized country, in a functioning democracy, with a free press and legal protections and medical expertise and all the other things that civilization is supposed to provide. I sit with the dispatch late at night sometimes, the journalist's 3 paragraphs, the specific number, the grandmother's name. I think about what Shirin knew, which at 3 years old was probably very little about any of this, the meeting, the vote, the hands. She would have known only the texture of the days that followed, the absence of a place she was supposed to go, the quality of her grandmother's silence, the door that did not open. Children that age understand the shape of things without understanding their content. They feel the weather before they can name it, the 18 hands. I hold on to those too. Because they are also in the record, 18 people who sat in the same room, heard the same arguments, felt the same fear, and kept their hands in their laps. The vote records both numbers. The story contains both. I think it matters to hold both numbers, not because 18 equals 32, or because the minority redeems what the majority decided, but because the 18 hands are evidence that the other decision was available in that room. On that evening, to those specific people, it was possible. 32 chose differently. 18 did not. That is the distance. It is not very far. That is what makes it so hard to sit with. I want to come back now to the broader context, because the Aschach meeting did not happen in isolation, and the isolation is part of what makes it easy to treat as an exception, rather than as a data point in a pattern. In the United States, which was further along the curve than anywhere in Europe at that point, the equivalent situations had been playing out for several years already. Children who had contracted the virus through blood transfusions, the hemophiliac children, mostly, who had received contaminated clotting factor before the blood supply was screened, had faced similar situations when their families attempted to enroll them in schools. The cases had gone to courts. Some of them had gone to federal courts. The courts had, in most cases, sided with the children on legal grounds, disability, discrimination law, constitutional protections, the medical consensus that the virus was not transmitted by the ordinary activities of school attendance. The law had been clear. The law had been applied. And in some of those communities, after the courts had spoken, the families had still faced harassment, vandalism, threatening letters, the ordinary sustained unpleasantness of living among people who had been told by every authority that they were wrong, and had decided that this particular authority could not be trusted. The Ryan White case was known in medical and journalistic circles by 1990, though not yet widely outside the United States. A teenager in Indiana, a hemophiliac who had contracted the virus from a blood transfusion, had been barred from his school by the school board and then admitted by court order, and then faced such sustained harassment from other parents and students that his family had eventually moved to a different city, where the reception was different. He was known by then as an advocate, a young man who traveled and spoke and explained, with a clarity and patience that shamed the adults he was explaining to, what the virus was and was not, and what the fear was doing to people who had done nothing to deserve what the fear was directing at them. He was 17 in 1990. He would die the following year. The Ryan White situation was not identical to Shirin's. He was older. His case had taken on public dimensions that transformed it into something beyond a single family's experience, and the American legal and cultural context was different from the Austrian one in ways that matter. But the structure was the same. A child who had contracted a virus through no action of their own, a community that knew, because the medical consensus was available and consistent, and had been explained by every relevant authority, that the child posed no danger, and a response from that community that proceeded as though the available knowledge was not sufficient reason to extend normal human consideration to the child. In Indiana, in Aschach, the structure was the same. I was working on a different piece around that same time, about a clinic in Moscow where a small number of children with HIV were being followed by a team of pediatric specialists. I spent an afternoon there, talking with one of the doctors, a woman in her 40s, calm, precise, with the quality of attention that comes from treating patients no one has written adequate guidance for. I mentioned the Aschach story. I wanted to know what she thought would happen if an equivalent situation arose in Moscow. She thought about it for a moment before she answered. She said that in the near term, a vote like the Aschach vote could not happen here, because parents in a Soviet kindergarten would not know about the diagnosis of a particular child. The medical records did not travel. The mother would not be told to inform the staff. The staff would not be told to inform the other parents. The opacity of the system was, in this specific case, functioning as a form of protection, not a principled protection grounded in any policy, but a passive one, resulting from the same institutional reflex that kept almost everything hidden. Then she paused and said, "But this protection will not hold. The epidemic will force the system to become honest about diagnoses, because it has to become honest to respond to them. And when the system becomes honest, we will have our Aschach meetings." Just a few years later than they did. She did not say this with alarm. She said it the way she said everything, which was with the level gaze of someone who had thought it through already and was reporting her conclusion. What I find myself returning to is the question of what it takes, what specific combination of information and framing and community leadership to produce the 18 rather than the 32, not to eliminate the fear, which cannot be eliminated by decree or argument, but to ensure that the fear does not express itself in a vote against a 3-year-old. The evidence suggests that it is possible, that the 18 hands in Aschach and the communities that responded differently in other cases were responding to real differences in how the question had been presented to them. Sweden's school curriculum, a community health worker who had spent time building trust before the vote was called. A local doctor who had stood up at a meeting and explained the medical facts clearly enough and with enough credibility that the fear had somewhere accurate to go. These are not glamorous solutions. They do not have the clarity of a court order or the finality of a law. They require sustained effort before the crisis, not reactive response after it. They require someone to have decided, before the meeting is called and the hands go up, that the preparation for that meeting matters. Most communities do not make that decision in advance. Most communities make it afterward, when they are writing the retrospective and trying to understand how the vote went the way it did. Erika Bogner said she could understand her neighbor's fear, and that they simply did not know enough. She was describing both the problem and its solution in the same sentence, without being able to see it as a solution, because by the time she said it, the vote had already been taken and her granddaughter had already been excluded, and understanding the fear was not going to reopen the kindergarten door. Understanding it was all she had left that she could offer. I think she offered it because it was true, and because she was the kind of person who preferred accurate statements about the world to satisfying ones, even when the accurate statements cost more. I think about her when I encounter people who say that the response to fear is reason, as though reason is a tool you can deploy in the moment of the vote and expect it to work. Reason helps before the vote, in the months of patient preparation, in the curriculum decisions and the community conversations, and the presence of a trusted local doctor at the meeting. In the moment of the vote, what you have is what has been built before the moment. Aschach had 32 votes worth of what had been built. The 18 is what I think about now. The 18 hands that stayed down. I want to know what those people knew, or felt, or were constituted to feel in that moment that allowed them to sit in the same chairs, hear the same arguments, feel the same fear, and not raise their hands. I want to know what the difference was, not because the answer would change what happened in Aschach, because the answer might help build something different in the next room before the next vote, when the chairs are arranged and the agenda reaches the item about the next child. 18 is not enough, but it is what was there. It is what the room produced beside the 32. The two numbers are both in the record. I keep both of them.